This video is about commas. It corresponds to section 7.12.1 of the Applied Analog Electronics textbook. Now, there's no way that a short video can cover all the rules in English about using commas. So I'm just going to hit on a few of the ones that seem to cause problems with students doing technical writing. Alright, so one of the first things is when do you use commas between chunks of a sentence? And here I'm talking about full phrases like, I went to the lab and built a circuit. When you have two items like this that are joined by and or any other conjunction, and they're not full sentences by themselves, there's no comma. So two items, no comma, unless they're full sentences. If it's I went to the lab and I built a circuit. Each one of these is independently a full sentence, and so when you join them with the and, you put a comma. This is probably the most common difficulty people have with commas, is trying to decide whether to put one in or not before a conjunction. Two items that are not full sentences, no comma. Two items that are full sentences, comma. And now this for conjunctions. What about three items? Well, if you've got three items, A, comma, B, or C, in this class we're going to insist on that extra comma. This is sometimes referred to as the Oxford comma or the serial comma. And in American written English, it's fairly standard. In British English, it's not quite as common, but I'm going to insist on it because it does greatly improve the readability of lists. Incidentally, when you have a list with 2, 3, 4 items in it, make sure that each of these objects in the list are grammatically and semantically parallel. So if one of them is an imperative, do this, the others should also be imperative. If one of them is a noun, the rest should be nouns. You shouldn't put a verb in one place, a noun in another place, an exclamation in another place. The lists should be both grammatically and semantically parallel. If they're properties of a device, they should all be properties. One shouldn't be something totally different. That's actually one of the biggest problems that I see in student lists, is that they just sort of are putting down concepts and not paying attention to whether the concepts are parallel to each other, whether they correspond to the same sort of thing. If you're going to put them in a list, make sure they're parallel. Okay, so that's taking care of conjunctions. What if I want to put the two sentences together, but I don't want a conjunction? I went to the lab. I built a circuit. Do you put a comma here or not? Answer, absolutely not. Putting a comma here would be what's called a comma splice. And you cannot put a comma there. You cannot join two sentences with just a comma. There are several other choices. One reasonable choice is a conjunction. Another reasonable choice, sometimes, is an em dash. But a comma there is prohibited. Sometimes you can put a semicolon instead of an em dash. There are subtle differences in terms of what they mean. The semicolon is expressing that it's a continuation in some sense, that it's a part of a series of things, whereas the em dash is more parenthetical, sudden change in direction of what you're saying. This distinction is kind of subtle and takes some practice to figure out which one is better in any given context. Generally, if you're not sure whether it's to use an em dash or semicolon, you're probably better off going to the comma and conjunction, because that's sort of the simplest and easiest to use. Use the semicolon and em dash only when they are more natural to you. Incidentally, the semicolon also gets used when you have a list of things, but the things themselves have commas in them. So if A, B, or C here, if any of those had a comma inside it, it would get very confusing to use commas both internal to the elements and to separate the elements. So that in that case you use a semicolon at the upper level to separate the elements and the comma just inside the elements. Okay, where else students have problems with commas? Another very common problem is for non-restrictive clauses. I went to the lab where I built a circuit. This sentence can be punctuated with or without a comma, but its meaning changes. When I've got the comma, as I've done here, it's implying that this person, the reader, already knows what lab I'm talking to. I went to the lab. I've defined, the lab's already known. The students know, the reader knows what the lab is that I'm talking about. And then I can say, where I built a circuit. That's sort of providing extra information about what I did there. If I left the comma out, I would be asserting that the where I built a circuit is defining which lab I mean, and that you don't already know which lab because you have to read the restrictive clause where I built a circuit in order to know which lab I'm talking about. So the comma is used when it's non-restrictive, when what's being provided here, this clause is providing additional information that's just extra. It isn't changing which lab I'm talking about. If it's selecting out of a number of possibilities exactly which one I mean, if it's restrictive, then I cannot put the comma. An important distinction that's made there with where, you use the same one for both restrictive and non-restrictive, but if you're using which or that, which is the non-restrictive one, it needs a comma, that is restrictive and can't have a comma in front of it. So the which and that distinction is the same non-restrictive restrictive distinction that I've shown here, but with where, the only way it's told is by whether the comma is there or not. So the comma becomes fairly important. It's carrying semantic content. Okay, that's probably most of the ones that cause students a lot of trouble. There are a lot of other rules for commas in English, and if you're uncertain about it, I would recommend getting one of the writer's handbooks or secretarial handbooks, they used to be called, that explains the punctuation rules and gives lots of examples. There's quite a bit of information on the web, some of it contradictory, but don't just assume that, oh, I can put commas anywhere I want. It really is hard on the reader if you just toss in commas as if they were sugar or icing on a cookie. Also, don't just say, oh, commas, nobody cares about them, I'll just leave them all out. I know a lot of you do that when you're doing phone texting, and in phone texting it's considered normal not to put in any punctuation, but for formal writing, like you'll be doing for your design reports, your punctuation really matters. Pay attention to it, follow the traditional rules for it.